We are so pleased to have Edward Hadas here. I'm going to give him a formal introduction and then get out of the way, and we're going to get right on to it. So that if the second half of your evening has a different selection, you'll get to that on time. Edward Hadas is a journalist and financial analyst and currently a research fellow at Blackfriars Hall of Oxford University. For several years, he was economics editor at Reuters Breakingviews and columnist at Reuters.com, where in 2013 he was awarded Reporter of the Year for commentary and analysis. Previously, he was an assistant editor of the Lex column of comment and analysis at the Financial Times and assistant editor at Breakingviews. Edward received the Business Journalist of the Year Award for Economics in 2009. He has also taught political and social philosophy at the Maryvale Institute in Birmingham, UK. Before becoming a journalist in 2004, he worked for 25 years as a financial analyst for various firms, including Morgan Stanley and Putnam Investments. He has degrees in philosophy, classics, and mathematics from Oxford University and Columbia University, and an MBA from SUNY Binghamton. He was born in 1956 in New York, grew up in St. Louis, and has worked in Buffalo, Boston, Paris, and since 1992 in the UK. His son Julian is here this evening, and we originally were thinking this was going to be a tag team match. It was going to be Edward, then Julian. Because of his professional obligations that he may not speak in public without authorization, it is Edward on Brexit and not Julian on other matters. And I do want to thank Rachel Hadas, who is right here, who first proposed this evening, and I am one to say yes, if at all possible, but it is her idea, and her bringing Edward was coming here, and Julian were coming here, so this is how it all happened, and thank you, Rachel. And here is Edward Hadas.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then there should be some time for questions before you all rush off to more exciting things. And I'm going to talk about Brexit, which is the British vote to leave the European Union, which was a very sad day in my life last June, and I've been spent the last year and a bit trying to recover, and being the sort of person that tries to recover by thinking about things. I've thought about it quite a lot, and I will share with you more or less what I've learned. Don't pay any attention to this yet. We'll come to that in a minute. But that's part of the talk. The question that I want to think about, because I think it's a very important question for the world, is what caused this very surprising outcome of this vote, and what does it mean in terms of both what's going to happen, how will the British leave the European Union, or will they leave it? And I'll give you my prediction of that by the time we're done. And also, what does it mean about the state of politics, particularly in the developed world? And I'm going to draw a few parallels to what's happening in the United States. So I think there are some global trends that one wants to think about. But the first thing I want to talk about is, in fact, what Europe is. Europe is a region, it's a name, it's a geography, and it's also very much an idea. And as an idea, that's really what we're fighting about in Brexit. So Europe has had various forms over its history of people thinking we should have a European unity. Most recently, Hitler had a very clear idea of how Europe should be unified, which was not wildly popular outside of certain classes in Germany. But before that, there was Napoleon, and before that, really, there were a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who weren't thinking so much of political unity, but philosophers who thought of a kind of common ideas and culture. Before that, there was a Christian culture, Christendom, we sometimes call it, where there was a kind of unity of religion that, at least in dreams, there was supposed to be. At various times, people thought there would be what was referred to as the Holy Roman Empire, a political union that matched the religious union. They never got terribly close, but it was always a sort of thought that there was some unity that lay behind Europe. And that region that was Europe in various times was centered around Italy, Rome in the days of when it was a Christian idea, France when it was a French idea, Germany when it was a German idea, but never really the UK, or as it is now, the UK, Britain, England. That's always been, as it is geographically, somewhat on the edge of Europe, just as, say, Poland or Scandinavia or Greece are on other edges of Europe. And so there was a question, and this question came to huge sort of fruition after the failure of the Nazi attempt to unify Europe in this totalitarian image. I mean, obviously, what Hitler had in mind in the end is a little bit hard to say, but he certainly had an idea of a single culture. And after the war, in fact, during the war, there was a great idea that we should have a Europe that was united in important ways and very peaceful. I once met a man who was telling me about his teacher. This man was older than I am, and his teacher was older than he was, who had been an Italian prisoner in the resistance in the Second World War, and sitting in prison had drafted what was basically going to be the charter for eventually the European Union, starting as an economic community, and had smuggled this out in cigarette papers, the sort of outline of this. So there were these idealists sitting in the 1940s and then after the war who felt that something terrible had been broken in European culture. There was a European culture, and it had to be reconstructed. That has gone on now for more than half a century, that reconstruction, and it has ended in what everyone outside of England, the United Kingdom, recognizes as the European entity, which is now called the European Union. And it's an odd entity from a lot of points of view, in that if you think of American history, when the U.S. was set up, it was to be truly a federal system. The states were to be, in fact, independent governments, and there would be a federal government that was in some way on top of them. Over the years, it certainly drifted towards a single, very powerful national government, and the states are now much more sort of administrative units than they are distinct cultures. The idea in the European Union has generally been, and not everyone feels this way, to have a much more truly federal system, in the sense that the nation states take care of most of the things that are relevant to people in their daily lives. So the nation states take care of education, health care, pensions, most of the labor law, national industrial policies to some extent. So most of the things that you would, welfare systems that you would deal with the government, you deal with your national government. What the European Union did was engage in things that made sense on the idea anyway is you engage in things that make sense on a European level. So industrial regulation, there's common trade, they make it easy to move from country to country as a person, to do business in country across the regions. They regulate environmental issues to a large extent, because those have implications around the region. And they also have a sort of a court of justice that sets standards that protect individuals from the irrationalities of, at least so they would claim there. So this effort has been going on since roughly, depending how you look at it, the late 40s, early 50s, early 60s. The UK joined the predecessor to the European Union in 1975, 73 referendum. So it's been working, and there is a question then, and this is where my little graphic comes in, is how European are we? How much has this worked? How much do we think of ourselves as European? Now remember, this isn't the same thing as saying, I'm not French, I'm European, I'm not Italian, I'm European. It's a sense of saying, as the new president of France, Emmanuel Macron, said, we are French and European. And he carefully had his official portrait so that there were equal-sized European and French flags, one on each side of him. So the idea is, do we feel European? Now, to say that is, I'm going to make a huge set of generalizations here of the kind that is really good to make in public speaking, because you know, I don't have to give you any footnotes. But I will say that everything I say is a great generalization of what Europeans think as compared to what British think. And I will say that there is a very clear sort of gradient, if you will, of to qualify this idea that the younger you are, the more likely you are to say that you're European in the ways that I'm about to talk to you about. And the more educated you are, the closer you are to the elite of the society, the more likely you are to feel European. So depending on where you go on holiday, on vacation in Europe, and who you talk to, if you're renting from a peasant in your farmhouse rental, he will probably sound less European than if you were renting from a professor in a city rental. But having said that, I'm happy to make broad generalizations, and I hope you will be happy to listen. So there are many aspects to thinking of yourself as European, and the point of this little graphic is to show you how the English, the British, and really one should say the English, because the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish, or the other parts of the United Kingdom, feel much more European and voted that way. Well, the Welsh didn't, but they're backwards people. Than the English themselves. This is largely an English debate. So I have this is meant to be a sort of amber, we have green, red. Green is European, amber here is mixed, and red you'll see. So in terms of thinking of their politics, I would say in general, the Europeans think of themselves as integrated into the European system. They moan quite a bit about it, they feel alienated from it and so forth, but they accept it as part of the political environment, just as if you come from Vermont, you would think the Vermont state system is part of the US system, and you would think that was normal and basically a good idea, even though those fools in Washington don't know what they're talking about. The fools in Brussels also don't know what they're talking about. Used to be a very important part of the European identity is religion. That is shared. There is no religion anywhere in Europe left that has any effect. It used to be that the English hated the Europeans because they were all a bunch of nasty Catholics, except for the Protestants, who they hated for being German. And now, though, everyone shares the same basic atheistic cultural values. And then the values that go along with that look at something like gay marriage has just swept through Europe, including, Malta, which is the most Catholic country, just legalized it. The Irish just elected a gay, I think he's a married gay prime minister. I mean, these kind of values are very much spread through Europe. The only exception now would be in Eastern Europe, where they are still adjusting to the 20th century, and will eventually get through that, and then the 21st century will presumably follow. In popular culture, which is a pretty big part of people's lives, that has not become very European either in Europe or there. There's a big television show, Eurovision, but that's probably the extent of it. Sports, though, one might mention, which is popular culture, football, the European regional sport is actually a European thing. So it's not entirely national, but it's not as European integrated as some of these other things. Curiously, English is the regional language, and this is the one area where, of course, the English feel perfectly at home. The English go on holiday and they speak their own language. The French have to go on holiday and speak English when they go to Italy, and so forth. So that, in that sense, English is traditionally, at least in the U.S., has been a very unifying force. Language is a dividing force in Europe, but from the English point of view, it's less dividing than because everyone speaks your language, so it's great. I think one of the key differences here that is the lessons from World War II where what the Europeans learned is that we should stop fighting each other and killing each other in a massive way, and that we have a lot more in common than against each other, and that if we start to argue about, say, steel tariffs or whether we should license ski instruction in the same way in Switzerland and Austria and France, we say we really shouldn't. What we have learned from World War II is we should not start arguing with each other in a way that would take us towards war, and that we are really in this together in a very important way. What the British learned from World War II is that we are a heroic, plucky nation that stood up against the Nazis when no one else did, and we are really the people that won the war. They often forget the American contribution. So there is, in this sense, this founding story, which is a true story. It's as true as any historical oversimplification is, that what Europe is this country. The Second World War was a kind of civil war of people who love each other but hate each other, and that we can do better than that. Except the English don't really see it that way, and that has had a lot of in-point. And similarly, although less dramatically, the way that they think about peace in the world, the Europeans overall do not have a huge reliance on the idea of military force. They certainly rely a lot on the American alliance with NATO, but the idea that how we look towards the future is to try and create peace through compromise and through discussion is very deeply ingrained, I would say, in the European approach. I think it's much less ingrained in the British, which has a much more still sort of recovering from, it was said in the 50s that they've lost an empire and looking for a place in the world. That in some ways remains somewhat true. That's not actually true if you meet British diplomats, who tend to be, the ones I've met, actually quite European in their approach. But in terms of the sort of the common idea of how to look at things, there's a much more national approach, less regional. Now in the economy, since 1970s, the economy has become entirely regional. When I first came to Europe in 1989, I was a financial analyst, as was mentioned, and I was following various companies as an equity analyst, and one of them was this company that made ball bearings, which is a very important industrial product. This is a Swedish company, SKF. And they had, at that point, were just in the process of ending a system where they had a French subsidiary that made ball bearings to French specifications, a German subsidiary, an English subsidiary. They had separate warehouses in each country, separate product lines. And so, in effect, there was a union of national companies with a research laboratory and some bookkeeping in common. And they were in the process of changing that in the late 1980s to having a single European product line with standard specified products across the region, warehouses that shipped across the region. That's a microcosm. Multiply that by, say, 200,000, and you start to understand how the European economy is tightly unified. For SKF to separate out, say, its British operations would be virtually inconceivable. It would be vastly expensive because they're so completely integrated in the way that they ship, manufacture, and really think about the world. And that would be true of virtually every industry now in Britain, in Europe, that it is a single European economy. The approach to law is another topic that one thinks a lot about. The British have their own common law system that's been very successful. A lot of contracts are written in British law to be adjusted. Divorces, Britain is the best place if you are very rich and a woman wronged, go to Britain to get your divorce. They are very good. But overall, the European system, which is largely, the national systems are largely based on the Napoleonic Code, and they have a somewhat different perspective. I was talking the other day to a man teaching European law at Oxford, and he said he thought the British system was better, but he thought it was substantially different, and that accounted for certain issues in sort of the way they approach regulation. Also, there was a British mentality and a European mentality that was somewhat different, not dramatically different. One of the sort of social trends of the 20th and now 21st century is the creation of giant, very, well, either smothering or comforting welfare states, take your pick. The Europeans tend to think of them as comforting, and they have very extensive ones. The British system is substantially less generous, although when you come to America, you think the British system is remarkably generous. And there's been a great leveling of the class system, starts with the French Revolution, continues through most of the 19th century. In most of Europe, that's less true in the UK. Now, I think if you asked some people in the UK, they would put that in the red line here. They would say there was a very different systems in the UK from Europe. But as an outsider, I tend to see it as a more nuanced difference. And then we're almost done here. Destiny, like what are we thinking of our future? Again, Macron, the new French president, gave a very sort of articulate idea of our future as being European, with the distinctiveness of our nations and our histories, but working together in a big bad world with, there are 300, well, depending where you put the line, about 400 million people. In Europe, there are 1.3 billion in China, 1.3 billion in India. As those countries become richer and more powerful, Europe is going to be a smaller place. I once was in Beijing, and someone was talking to me about he had a job of introducing European diplomats to various Chinese politicians as Europeans would come around. And he had the finance minister of Belgium, a country of, I think, 8 million people, so it's smaller than Beijing. And he said he was trying to explain to people this was actually a country. It had its own government and a foreign policy and finance and so forth. And they were really struggling to understand that. So the European notion in this vast generalization that I'm drawing for you is that we have our destiny as European in the big world that we're in. If we don't stick together, we will be squashed by the Chinese. And we have so much in common that it's not hard for us to stick together this way. And when I say that, I mean, if you read European newspapers, all you hear about is bitching and complaining and fighting and so forth, and these people are doing that and this. There was a show of unity now after the Brexit vote, but in general there's always fighting, but that doesn't mean it's family fighting with a common goal, not a separation. Whereas I was very struck after the referendum talking to British people who, as it were, should have known better. There are people who had a lot of European experience and lived there and worked with Europeans, and they would frequently emphasize how much they didn't feel European. They felt English, they felt sometimes British, they felt they were very different, and that their future, they resented this idea that they should be part of Europe. As I said, the younger you are, the less likely you are to think that in England. So the students that I talk to are very much European, but their teachers are often, as they used to say, they were reluctant Remainers. So they voted Remain, stay in the European Union, but with a certain regret, a heavy heart, because they know it's right. Their heart tells them their head tells them it's right, but in their heart they really wish they could be just English and not have to deal with all those people who speak with a strong accent. And again, the self-identity is very similar. This idea that we think of ourselves as, do we think of ourselves as European? Well, I mean, it would be silly to say, oh yeah, the French think of themselves, or the Italians, as Europeans first. They certainly think of themselves as their nation, and often sometimes their region. You can see in Catalonia in Spain, where they want to be independent. They don't even want to be Spanish, but in a sense they want to be Catalans, independent, because they can see themselves as Europeans and Catalans, which they feel happier with than taking orders. They'd rather take orders from Brussels than from Madrid. So, but they are still, I don't think they're green in the sense of really thinking themselves as European, say, equally with with their national identity. The English, again, very much red. So you look at this picture, taking away all the qualifications, and you can see why the English would be the first country to vote to leave the European Union. It has a very distinct place in Europe. There are 27 members. We would be here for many years if I went through each of the countries, and I certainly don't feel knowledgeable enough to do that. But there would not be another country with as much red, and this looks more like tan, but think of it as amber, and as little green as the UK. So this was the challenge that the UK faced in terms of how do you deal with that. And what I would say, and that's really all I'm going to use that slide for. Will this disappear? Yep, well done. What I would say is that while this has always been true, there has always been a small group of crackpots who thought that this was an important enough issue to have a referendum about, or to say that we should really leave the European Union. And those people were getting older all the time. If you looked at the referendum vote, there's a straight line of age. So if you're sort of 18 to 24, about 75% of the people voted to stay in the European Union. And it keeps on going down till about 25% of people over 75. So this is the grandparents' revenge, that they don't really feel European, and they voted to disenfranchise their grandchildren. Thank you, say the grandchildren. So it's in a sense, one can make a whole story about how this is a terrible accident, and it's the British press, and it's these old people, and it's the ignorant people. It's the same thing with education. The more educated you are, directly goes down your likelihood to vote to leave the European Union. Although there are some educated people, the leaders of the Leave campaign were very educated, just foolish in my opinion. But no one ever said that schooling made you wise, just knowledgeable. These people, so you can tell the story as a sort of a series of unfortunate coincidences of when the vote was held and how it was regulated and how dishonest it was, and David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister, was incompetent. And all of that is true. But the thoughts that I wanted to get through, just say very quickly, because I want to talk about what's going to happen next. The talk is this, that these accidents, things happen, as it were, for a reason in history. And sometimes we have to struggle hard to find a reason. But in this case, I think we can see a pretty deep pattern. A lot of people like to think about it as an economic pattern. Maybe there's been too much there's the people who are left behind by modern world and they're disgruntled. And then there's the alternative theory that people are too rich and so they get restless. I'm not sure how much economics in itself has to do with it. But what you can see is that there's a kind of two sides. One is popular alienation. The people feel that the establishment, the power structures, that they don't feel very close to them, they don't feel they're representing their interests. And that's a phenomenon you're very familiar with here. And alternatively, you can say the people in power are, I like to call it a sclerosis, a hardening of the system, a system that used to work reasonably well. They would rise to challenges, they would identify problems, they would be willing, the political establishment was willing to discipline the businessmen or to find unity. If you have a problem, say in the United States, you have a healthcare problem or a drug problem, you would make a national commitment, you would cross party lines, you would take bold policies, you would get rid of old policies that no longer seemed acceptable. There might be fights, there might be struggles, but effectively there was a kind of vitality to the political system. So whether you want to, and that's gone. I don't think I have to tell you that. It's a common rant, and you can have someone else give that rant in another speech. But it's gone, and it's gone to some extent everywhere in the developed world. Where the political system seems not responsive. Or you could say where the people seem more alienated. And maybe they're two different factors, maybe they feed off each other. But in any case, what you can say is that this European referendum and the inept response to it and all of the bad management and was not necessary, even though there are these differences between England and Europe. But what has happened is that these differences were allowed to take political form because the system, the political system, wasn't working. And I mean, I think one can say here in the U.S. that this is similar. And I think it's perhaps interesting that the two English-speaking countries are world leaders in decay, in that sense of being very successful economies, particularly the U.S. historically. Well, the British were very successful up to the 1880s, and they've been losing ground since then. But I don't think it's actually a coincidence that these two English-speaking countries seem to be the most politically dysfunctional, to judge by the polarization that led to Trump being elected, and since then, and then the Brexit referendum. I think that probably does have to do with the relatively weak welfare states in both of these countries, and with various issues in their history of great powers and their political roles in the world being somewhat challenged, and probably also with certain social patterns that seem to be very difficult. But what one can say is that the forces in society that are supposed to unify and help make good decisions do not seem to be very strong. It was very striking after the referendum. We got a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, who basically said, well, I'm not going to talk to business people. Her political advisors told her it was not good to talk to business people about Brexit. And this is crazy. I mean, it was insane because the economy is in danger of almost collapsing if they didn't have a reasonable arrangement, and very few people inside government really were very close to the business world. They had relied on business people to help them, guide them through business decisions, business-related decisions, and so to cut them off was incredibly self-destructive. But she just did this, and that was bad. And then what's even worse is that the business people didn't complain. So they just kept quiet, hoping for a better time. And they got a better time because Theresa May, fortunately, was stupid enough to call an election, and stupid from her point of view, which she then lost. And then now she's been more open to business people, so there's a change in the mood. But the inability of civil society, of the businesses, the cultural leaders, to make a coherent case, it seems to me, is part of this failure of mission. So to summarize this part of the talk, and then I'm going to look forward a little bit, is to say that on the one hand, you have some distinct cultural differences between England and the rest of Europe, and that really is the wedge that drove this referendum forward. And on the other hand, you have this tremendous problem of the system, the political cultural, educational system failing. And that gave the ground for this wedge to be widened, this wedge of cultural distinctiveness. And so now we've got to look what comes next. Well, the UK is in a corner because it can't actually leave the European Union without substantial economic harm. It just is impossible. And as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Secretary of the Treasury, although somewhat more powerful, said, I don't think very many people voted for leaving in order to become poor. So you're a politician trying to reflect what you think of as a mandate to leave the European Union. And you're also a politician thinking in the next election, if our economy is doing badly and unemployment is up and house prices are down, because that's a big issue in the UK, and people go on holiday to Europe and they find it very expensive, and all of these issues, we're going to lose the next election. So I am really in a mess. I cannot leave the EU without suffering electoral loss, and I cannot not leave the EU without suffering electoral disgruntlement from the people who've said, to whom we told that we're going to do this. So effectively, you have a choice of humiliation. This is a comment by one of the Financial Times writers, Gideon Rachman, and I liked his idea. You can take the pain of leaving as much as possible the European Union, of all those thousands and thousands of ties, so you have very severe economic pain, irritating the young people particularly. That's what they call hard Brexit. You can then make alternative one, so that's humiliating. Alternative two, you say, I personally led the country into the Red Sea, tried to part the Red Sea, and it didn't work, and so my army drowned. Great, what a soldier. Alternative two is you have soft Brexit, which means that all you do is keep everything the way it is, but pretend that something has changed because we're no longer a member of the European Union. So we no longer get to vote on the laws, we no longer influence the policies, we just have to take them. So I'm a great leader. What I have done is now lost all the things that might be helpful to me, but I've gained the ability to say we are no longer, instead of being members of the European Union, we're now slaves to the European Union. Thank you. And then the third thing you could say is, let's just call the whole thing off. This was just a mistake. Sorry. And that obviously has its own, I am a great leader. I thought we would just do this thing that really made no sense. And after a year or two, and we've lost various things in time and growth and so forth, and trust. Okay, sorry, it was just a mistake. I mean, this is the married man who comes back from his affair and says he wants to, I didn't mean it. It's awfully hard to get back into the, you tend to have some trouble after that, no matter how sincere your apology is. And the British apology wouldn't be very sincere since everyone, as I said, there are these cultural differences, so it would be a sort of best case. So what's going to happen? Well, one thing is that 2019 is the deadline, and there's no way that they can negotiate anything like a deal that will take care of all the different complexities of being disentangled from Europe. So they're going to have what they're now calling a transition or an adjustment period. But because the European side of this, the EU side, basically calls the tune, since the British, as I say, face this trilemma of misery. So what they will do is they'll say, well, it's fine, you can leave, but you just have to continue to do everything exactly the same, pay into our common budget, and we will, of course, cut back all the benefits you get because you're no longer a member. So you will be facing this really terrible deal. Now, I think what's going to happen for what it's worth, as a pundit, I'm a sort of junior league pundit, is that they will do what happened to the Republican Party with its health care reform here. When you face the impossible, eventually you collapse. So, the Republicans couldn't figure out a way to both cut Obamacare and not cut the number of people who benefited from Obamacare, and eventually they managed to fight with themselves enough to not do anything. I think something similar will inevitably happen. Well, not inevitably, nothing is inevitable in politics, but I think that's the most likely outcome, is that the English will fight among themselves for the next year, and either will leave and then come right back because they will realize there's nothing, or more likely they'll overthrow the government, say it was all a terrible mistake and we're very, 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 very sorry. Can we please stay? But that's by no means guaranteed. Although, actually the reverse reading of Trump's inability to form a sort of revolution has been very sobering for a lot of the people in Brexit who were hoping that this was the beginning of the end. One of the sort of slogans was that we were, as the British were a lively, dynamic economy, this completely not supported by evidence, shackled to the deadly corpse of the EU. It has not looked that way since the economic news and also the cultural, all those things that identify in my graph of Europe. All of those things are now looking more like Europe is more unified and more dynamic, and so that corpse seems to be dancing around a bit. So I want to conclude and leave some time for questions with just thinking about the federalist idea that I mentioned at the very beginning, that there's a chance here, and there's a chap who wrote a very good essay back in the 70s or 80s, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppo, an Italian politician, who was talking about how the nation state, where you have a very clear border that's political, economic, cultural, and usually linguistic, that was established as a sort of natural state of governance in the world, has been the basic idea for the last couple of hundred years. And there's a long piece of history there of how that developed and what came before it and how it differs. But what he said, Padoa-Schioppo, is he said that period of history is over. And we in Europe have a chance of doing something completely new, never been tried before, in terms of finding a kind of governance that has many different levels, where nations as they have been are still very important, but that there are unities that are above that. He was, inspired by the United Nations that has a kind of global remit, but he was thought that Europe could be a kind of entity that had its own unity, its own division, its own richness, and instead of having these very sharp boundaries, would have much fuzzier boundaries and much more overlap. And now I personally have found that a very inspirational idea, and as I say, I think that's actually one of the ideas that was inherent in some of the early American before, all the way into the early into the 19th century. It got a little bit discredited with the Civil War and states' rights being used as justification for slavery. So it doesn't seem so sharp here. But I think actually it's a very powerful idea that manages to combine the best things about government close to you and the best things about having a large unity that keeps the peace and gets you the advantages that come with having a unified system where you can travel, study, learn from each other, and have a very large community. That's the European project, at least as I see it, and I think many Europeans would see that. They may talk about it as federalism, which makes the Eurosceptics, as they call them in the UK, that makes their blood boil. Federalism, it's the enemy, the devil. But it's actually, I think, a very good idea, and I think it's a very powerful one, and I think it's making progress in Europe. It's very much the idea of Merkel in Germany and Macron in France. But of course, it's a work in progress. It could be derailed. British exit, should it happen, I don't think is going to derail it, because, in fact, the British departure has increased the sort of sentimental attachment to Europe among a lot of Europeans, as we can see from the subsequent elections. But it's threatened. Europe has its problems. Its demography is very challenging. There are very few young people. There's a lot of migration in of people that may or may not be easily integrated. As I mentioned briefly, Eastern Europe is a challenge because the values aren't really quite as liberal there before. Long-term unemployment remains a huge issue. Populism is still Brexit-style thinking gets somewhere between 10 and 25% of the votes in most of Europe. The political sclerosis is a big problem in Spain and Italy and Belgium, as far as it goes, that important country. And indeed, the European Union is still a work in progress. It's only about 50 years old in its current form, and its institutions are already managed to be pretty sclerotic despite being young. They have to improve everything. So this vision isn't necessarily going to happen. But I think it's sort of the way that I at least like to model this, and to say that the European Union has been, the Brexit referendum and the subsequent negotiations, I think have helped a lot of Europeans see that they're onto something really that could be very valuable and it's worth working on. So with that, I'd like to just close and say that I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and that I hope I have shed a little bit of light on what must seem from this side of the Atlantic a very mysterious debate, and that you can now see at least some of the issues that are at stake. And so I think we've got, 10, 15 minutes for questions? Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I have a question, and it relates to
Ooh, okay.
The Scottish, of course, voted overwhelmingly to stay, and then they had their own referendum to stay within the UK, which barely passed. And I think they're threatening again that if the Brexit takes place, that they will have a referendum to potentially leave the UK. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I used to work with a colleague who referred to, there's this thing with Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith and David Hume, and he would say, oh, Scottish Enlightenment, that's what they feel after their 5th pint of beer. That's English-Scottish rivalry is a bit of a theme. So Scotland, in terms of its economics, cannot really afford independence, which is why, even by a narrow vote, it lost. It's a huge recipient of welfare payments from, net recipient from London. And its economy is very closely tied with the rest of the British economy. So we have this huge irony of Theresa May arguing about how the Scottish shouldn't think about another referendum. It's completely insane, she said, to tear yourself off from your largest trading partner just for political reasons. Wonder where she got that idea. Anyway, so there was a lot of enthusiasm for a referendum, and that's cooled down a bit. The Scottish Nationalist Party, which is the Independence Party, did very poorly in the last general election. They lost a lot of seats. On the other hand, the Conservative Party, which gained seats, is extremely pro-European, and the Conservative Party in the UK Parliament is a very weak hold on government, and so they can't really override these Scottish MPs. So this is another reason why I don't think that Brexit is going to happen, because I don't think the Scottish MPs will vote for it. I think it's part of that vision that I had of separate countries within this unity of Europe. The Scottish can make a very good case that they would be a country that would be freestanding or more freestanding. They already have a lot of autonomy in their government. And like the Catalans, if nation states dissolve a bit, they would be a natural case. Now, if you told people in Westminster that, they would say, yet another reason to stay in the European Union, to get out of the European Union if you think it's going to lead to dissolution. But in fact, if the English leave, I do think in due course the Scottish would rejoin the European Union, because there is a great sense there that that's where the opportunities are. And they really do not like the English as a sort of general way, so they would do it just to screw the English. Okay, other question?
In the United States, there's a kind of philosophy of the states that they're kind of the place where experimentation can happen, anywhere from gay marriage to legal pot. And then there's also the New England tradition of the town meeting. Is there, and for Europe, do you see that as a way to build some resilience? Is the lack of that one reason why Brexit could happen?
I think the experimentation part is very live in Europe. Say gay marriage, for example, moved from country to country. That would be an example, but also say in welfare programs. And this is something that I think a lot of people, politicians, don't focus on, because it's too, as they say in the trade, it's too granular. It involves actually reading something brief, more than 2 paragraphs. Is that there's a lot of joint scholarship and study inside of Europe of what things work and what don't work. So, for example, right now in Finland, there's an experiment in a couple of cities in Finland of a basic income, guaranteed minimum income, and it's a complicated story, but it might be a way to reform a very complex welfare systems. And it's not just the Finns who are looking at this experiment, which is in sort of a few 100,000 people in Finland. Social scientists from all over Europe look at it. And I can say I've just moved up to Oxford. It's fascinating to see how there is this European dialogue of people watching what works, what doesn't work, and say there's a huge educational rivalry. There are these tests called the PISA tests. Whenever a country does badly, and all countries think they do badly because all countries are persuaded that they should be at the top of the list, And you know, it's basically been a good force because they're forced to compare themselves to their peers and to try and figure out what will work for them. So there is some of that. A local force, no. Most European countries are very centralized, or at least regionalized in their governments, and there's relatively little local initiative. And there probably should be more, but you know, that would be an area to go forward. And the more the nation state dissolves as a central force, then the more that would be possible. But we're ways from that, I would say.
Perhaps reading too much between the lines and very impressed. I sense a assessment that one of the drivers for Brexit in England had to do with defending borders against uncontrolled immigration. Perhaps not perfectly admitted as an honest worry, but I wonder if you see that as a...
Yeah, I didn't mention migration. I mean, it's certainly on the list, and many people felt that this was, they did not like this change. And you know, I think one should have a little sympathy, particularly for people of my age and older. I'm getting more sympathy all the time for the way old people are crusty and difficult. You know, London in 1970, I think the foreign-born population of London was somewhere around 10%. It's now, I think, 60% foreign-born. Is that right? 40, 60, something. And you know, so the country has really changed, and this would be, you know, it's more true in England because it's been relatively successful. It has a relatively flexible labor market. English is the global language, and once we have migrant communities come, they tend to stay. And England was the first, or Britain was the first country to open its borders freely to people from Poland and Lithuania and the new entrants to the EU, and they came in very large numbers. And yeah, this has caused a certain amount of social disruption. There's been a big change. So it goes. I mean, it's, you know, it's also 10% of the population of Germany and France, and a rising number in Italy of migrants. And so it's just a challenge. It's very hard to see how you can go backwards on that. As an issue in the European Union referendum, it was a fraud because with the exception of very few towns, there's not much resentment against the European migrants. It's the Asian migrants that people don't like because there's a implicit racism. And also, I mean, if you find that people with different cultures, you know, you find them alienating and frightening, Poles are not going to be that alienating and frightening. I mean, you used to feel that they were Catholic and that was dangerous, but that doesn't bother people anymore. They drink a lot, they send their kids to school, they have the same aspirations that you do, they basically have the same values, they share this European history. It's very hard to feel I'm being invaded by Poles. It's just, you know, culturally. If you know, I'm invaded by Indians or you know, South Asians, you know, they really do come from a different culture, or Pakistanis, you know, they're a different religion, they take their religion seriously, which is incomprehensible to the English. The Poles take their religion a little bit seriously, so that's a problem, but it's not a big problem. They can get used to that. You probably have some Catholic friends anyway, and you're used to the idea they go to church. You adjust to that. But Islam is much more alienating to people, or alien from them, and thus alienating to them. But that has nothing to do with the European Union. There's no restrictions. Migration is one of the issues that's actually national, with the exception of within the European Union. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, before that she was what's called Home Secretary, and one of her jobs was migration, and she set up a target and explained that she was going to reduce migration from outside the EU, and was unable to do it because the need for skilled workers, the humanitarian concern of allowing people to let family members in, and general economic relations. So if you want to trade with India, they're very concerned that you allow Indians to get visas, and we do want to trade with India. It was very difficult to reduce migration into the UK. So, you know, it's a genuine issue in the sense that people don't like migrants, but if you're going to be that much richer than the rest of the world and that much more orderly, if you really want to reduce migration, and they're working on this now, as you have a lot of racist incidents, you murder migrants, You start with unemployment, make it miserable, and then they will stop coming. And then you can, be miserable and wretched just among yourselves rather than having to deal with foreigners. But that hardly seems like the real solution. This is, it used to be that most people in the world were so poor that it was really impossible for them to even conceive of migrating. They didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the means. Now, as people get richer and they have WhatsApp, it's much more conceivable. There are billions of people now who could think, okay, I could at least spend a couple of years in Europe, make some money, maybe settle there. It's more peaceful than where I live. There are more opportunities. That's a lot of pressure, and that's just going to be an issue until those countries get rich enough that people don't think, oh, that's a really interesting opportunity to go there. So I think this is a long-standing, that's my view, it's a long-standing problem. It's not going to be a solution in this way. And again, if you sell Brexit as this will solve our migrant problem, those 10% of the population that's foreign-born or foreign citizens of some sort, they'll just disappear, they'll melt away. That's just, that was another lie in that campaign. As I said, this campaign was very poorly policed. Okay, yeah.
Do you foresee any changes in the relationship you enjoyed in Ireland?
Well, it's one of the, it's interesting that the European Union has 3 issues that they're going to discuss before they discuss any other issues. And the 3 issues are the rights of European citizens inside the UK and vice versa, because there are quite a number of them. The amount of money that the British owe to continue to have trading relationships, and the Irish border. And so from a European point of view, this is a crucial issue because it's one of the incredible, Brexit is, I wrote a column about this a few months ago, and I said, what it is a thoroughly bad idea. If you sort of think reforming Obamacare and cutting out insurance for people is a bad idea, you might think that. But at least you can say Obamacare is not a perfect system. The thing about Brexit is there's no upside, and there are all these downsides. And one of the downsides is the Irish border, which, after the British have been messing around, had a bad Irish policy since at least the 16th century, arguably since the 10th century. It was good in the days of Bede when they, actually, they imposed the Western calendar on the Irish, the Celtic calendar. They've never been forgiven since then. So, it's a big issue. And I think we probably had reached the best the best relations within Ireland and between Ireland and Britain that, maybe since the 6th century. And they just decide to throw that away. And so, they're trying to think of some way to resolve this problem. There is a really easy way. It's just revoke the Article 50 that takes us out, and then we can just go back to where we can stay where we are. But if they do go through with it, yeah, it will have bad effect, and it will thoroughly irritate the Irish. The Irish are furious about this, and rightly so, and I think that will continue. It will cause all sorts of small to large problems. I do not think, for what it's worth, that we will return to the Troubles. That seems to me yesterday's problem. The Protestants and the Catholics no longer remember what church they go to, so it's there's no religious issue there. It's just an ethnic issue that's been gradually fading away. Yeah.
Do you see any upside for Europe and the rest of the world in this sort of way that we're committing this side, whatever the English-speaking countries are kind of exiting the rest of the world? It's terrible for us maybe, but is there any benefit for Europe not to have to deal with the British?
Yeah, for sure. The British have been, if you ask British people, they say, well, we're the only sensible people in the European Union, and without us, they'll just go from bad to worse. And many people that I know who are, I would think of as normally sensible, say this. And there's something to that in the sense that the British voice in the debates in Europe has been valued. And when you talk to people from other countries, I think they generally will say that the British have been, at the level of British cooperation inside Europe, they've been a help and good, and they are one of the 3 largest economies in the Europe, and they do have international experience and so forth. So they will be missed. But on the other hand, they have been a divisive, obstructionist, selfish force within Europe, and they will not be missed for that. Whether Europe is really united enough to be a force in the world, that seems, I just gave you a dreamy presentation of why that should be true, but I think that's at this point, a bit optimistic to say that that's going to happen. Okay, let me take one more question. Yeah.
What is the chance you think of running the referendum again and what would be the outcome if they did?
Well, one of the ways you could backtrack is you could backtrack unilaterally. The government just withdraws its application, or it could withdraw and say, we are going to do this again. We're just going to rethink a little bit and then wait. So that would be one way. Another way would be to say, we're going to have a referendum, and this time we're actually going to run the referendum so we win. Referendums, the tradition in European referendums is you hold them again and again until you get the result you want. And the way you do that is by changing, you say, oh, they've adjusted to this or adapted to that. And this referendum was run without, it was a deeply unfair referendum, which, as I say, it reflects the sclerosis of the system. So if the system could get a little bit more lively, you could have a fairer referendum. So the right wording is, do you wish to be poorer and give up on all of these things? And then, alternatively, do you wish to remain and look towards the future? And then you run it like that, and then you get the right answer. The language, the language, good question, was, should the UK remain in the European Union? Should the UK not remain in should the UK leave the European Union? You had to tick one of those boxes. And so it didn't explain at all what it meant to leave the European Union. It had no sense of what the implications of that were. And this is a referendum that's reversing 45 years of law, and it was an advisory referendum, so there was no particular reason to interpret it one way or the other. But typically a referendum of this sort, you would want a 60% majority to make a change. It won 52%, and that was with this incredibly dishonest campaign. If political advertising was subject to fraud law, these advertisements would be in prison, or well, no one goes to prison anymore for this kind of thing. But they would certainly not have allowed these advertisements because they were, knowingly, willingly dishonest advertisements. So the campaign was the question was framed in such a way. You can laugh at my suggested framing, but when you frame this as a dream, they do polls now, and they say, well, 60% of the people would like to control migration, but also to have free movement and settlement inside Europe. Well, why not? And I would also like to earn $250,000 a year for doing nothing. Poll, check. I would like to earn $250,000. Yes, I would not like to earn $250,000 for doing nothing. 85% of the people voted in favor of high incomes for no work. That's effectively what this referendum was. It was a very unrealistic thing. Okay, and that's a good note to change, to stop. Thank you very much.